Part 3. Money. No, not rich. I'm a poor man with money, which is not the same thing. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. To an imagination of any scope, the most far-reaching form of power is not money, it is the command of ideas. Oliver Wendell Holmes, The Path of the Law. The value of money can be based on two fundamental ideas. One is that the money alone has a physical value, such as in the case with gold and silver. And the other one is that it's based on a promise. So the gold and silver sort of belongs to the is side of things. You actually have that wealth. Whereas the money that's based on a promissory note is actually based on a promise. Somebody ought to perform an action when you present them with this money, although it has no substantive value in itself. Promissory notes were first created to transport wealth over long distances. If you were a merchant and you wanted to transport money across the ocean, then you could get promissory notes from your bank where you are and then cash those in for gold and silver at your destination. And this means that if your ship is lost, all that gold and silver isn't lost. The law of promissory notes is also known as the law of the sea, under two categories. At peace, it is the law merchant, and at war, it's called admiralty law. The most basic kind of promissory note is this. Suppose you're at a poker game and the chips are down and Bob's out of money. To make the next round of bets, he drops an IOU into the stack. Now everybody knows that Bob is good for the money, and whoever wins the money simply presents Bob with an IOU at a later date. The IOU gets destroyed and the money gets paid. It's the paper that carries the promise. This sort of thing happens with banking clearinghouses all the time. IOUs are commercial paper such as checks, electronic transfers, and other instruments. The commercial paper includes things like court judgments, stocks, bonds, checks, and other forms of lawful promises. It's all based on rational logic, and this is the law of water, the law of the sea, and the law of man. The tradition known as the law merchant has evolved into what's now known as the Uniform Commercial Code. Suppose Bob took John to court and exercised a claim against him. Suppose John had backed into his shed and damaged it, causing Bob to experience a financial loss. He could take John to court, and if the judgment was in Bob's favor, he'd have commercial paper in the form of a judgment, and that judgment allows him to exercise certain lawful rights in collecting money that he is owed to make him whole again. He might have to hire a sheriff or something or take something of John's until he receives his money. The judgment is just a piece of paper promising John that he has lawful means to collect the debt. Now, that's the nature of promissory notes. Now, before going any further with this, I want to talk about the nature of fractional reserve banking. It's often said that fractional reserve banking creates wealth from thin air. This really isn't strictly true, and it's not really possible. I think it was just a remark that somebody made as a joke, and it got carried on to reality. Promises do exist in reality, and these are promissory notes that we're passing around. Under fractional reserve banking, a bank operates with a reserve ratio. And for the purposes of the following example, we'll assume that the reserve ratio is 10%. This means that if I deposit money into a bank, the bank has to keep 10% of what I deposit, and they can lend out the remaining 90%. Does not mean that they can create wealth from thin air, as the following will illustrate. If I deposit $100, the bank may lend out $90 and must hold on to $10 as a reserve. Even if the bank has lent out $90 of my money, I can still walk in and take back my full deposit. If everyone does this, there's a run on the banks. If few people do this, everything works fine. That $90 inevitably gets deposited in a bank. It could be received as a payment from the one who borrowed it. It sits in a bank account somewhere, of which 10% is held. The rest, $81, gets lent out again. The pattern continues and continues until the banks have nearly $1,000 lent out on that $100 I deposited. The bank is paying interest on the savings accounts of $1,000 because it is holding all that money in accounts. It maintains the promise to all of the depositors, and that way the money is created from promise and responsibility on the part of the bank. Fractional reserve banking has the effect of interest rates. If the bank actually had to have the money that it lent you, interest rates would be around 30%. There'd be no upward mobility in the classes, and one could not borrow money to start a business or change his material well-being or improve his material well-being in society. Interest rates of 30% create stationary classes with little or no upward mobility within a society. Whether or not money should be lent at interest is another topic. I'm talking about what is and not necessarily what should be. Christian law states that usury is a sin. And Michael Hoffman explains usury in a video called Michael Hoffman Talks About Usury on YouTube. It's about 20 minutes long and it's a really good video. Usury may be at the root of our problems, and Hoffman makes an excellent case for this in the 20-minute presentation. This particular instance of usury, which I describe above, is not central to the corruption of the monetary system that's turned our elected representatives into whores. In the case of consumer side banking, the private side, fractional reserve banking is good for the economy, whether you agree with it ethically or not. It adds value to the consumer society. The money being passed around while backed by a promise from the bank does have a substantive value, the labor that backs it up. If people stop working for it, it would become worthless. The money has a value in that it represents actual labor. Now, so far I've been talking about private money, the money which is exchanged between individuals and companies and contracts working in the economy. The law that governs this money is known as commutative law because it is contracting between individual entities. Now I want to talk about public money, the methods which government finances itself in the country. This creates laws for which all are subject, and this is known as distributive law. The following quote explains the basic nature of government financing. The Federal Reserve banks are one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. There is not a man within the sound of my voice who does not know that this nation is run by international bankers. Louis T. McFadden. Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign swindlers. Again, Louis T. McFadden, Congressional Record. Now I'll explain the nature of public money. That is, the finance of governments. It's a fundamentally different nature than private money because it is created from a different promise. Governments do not create money directly. They create it with the central banks. The banks do not work with the governments work with the banks. The actual creation of money takes place using a process someone once called glad-handing. The glad-handing well has an unlimited depth. Governments create bonds and sell them to the bank. The bond itself is based on a promise that both sides of the glad-handing scheme know cannot be kept, as both know that even the existing debt cannot be repaid. The promise of the bond gives the money value and is ultimately dependent on labor actually earning the money and paying the taxes in the future. That's you and I. It presupposes that we are locked into debt slavery. Kant remarked on personality, debt slavery, and bondsmen in the following. No one can bind himself to this kind of dependence by which he ceases to be a person by contract, since it is only as a person that he can make that contract. Later in the text he adds, nor can a bondsman offspring be claimed as bondsman because he has given rise to the expense of being educated. For parents have an absolute duty to educate their children, and when the parents are in bondage, their masters take over this duty along with the possession of their subjects. And that's Kant, Metaphysics of Morals. The private banks don't provide any value to governments in lending them money other than managing monetary policy and the money supply for their own interests. The CIA, FBI, armies, constables, and everyone that carries a gun essentially works for the banks. The president has jurisdiction in domestic policy only. Wars are being fought for the expansion of the financial institutions. Violence is ultimately the promise from which the banks can create money to finance governments. FBI and National Academy of Sciences have both said that private gun ownership does not really increase crime rates. This causes one to stop and ask, why all this effort toward private gun ownership regulation and confiscation? Banks establish monetary policy quite separate from governments and operate in their own interest. Privately owned central banks have their hand on the trigger of a gun pointing at the economy. They can collapse the economy by changing the interest rates. It's up to them what the interest rates will be. Alan Greenspan has a famous YouTube video explaining the relationship of banks to the governments that is not really included in this video. So the governments really serve two masters, the banks and the people. They've got to keep two masters happy, and one cannot really serve two masters. The banks, in exchange for this privilege, always allow the politicians to borrow as much money as they want, keeping them out of the banking business. War and war machinery, government projects, a socialist state, all financed with borrowed money, allow the politicians to keep both masters happy. Under the current system of monetary creation in countries with central banks and fiat currency, every dollar in circulation is collecting interest for some bank. All money within the central bank economies have all their currency based on usury, that is, collecting interest. It requires continuous expansion of the economy just to meet the interest payments on the growing debt. So your taxes are really collected to pay the interest on the growing debt. They don't actually go towards running the society. And the debt really isn't real because it's based on a promise that cannot be kept. If all the loans were called in, there'd be no money left, and still some would be owing. James Traficant speaks on the record in the following quote. Mr. Speaker, we are here now in Chapter 11. Members of Congress are official trustees presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in world history, the U.S. government. We are setting forth, hopefully, a blueprint for our future. There's some who say it's a coroner's report that will lead to our demise. James Traficant, Congressional Record. Under the current central bank model, money enters the economy by three basic routes. Governments borrow it, corporations and companies borrow it, and people borrow it. For a dollar to exist in the economy, it must be a borrowed dollar. Every dollar in circulation is collecting interest for a bank somewhere. And the total debt always exceeds the money supply available. War has become the industry that keeps the economies expanding, borrowing, and spending to make interest payments on the debt. Countries around the world have been encouraged to convert to Western democracy, meaning the Western central banking model. If encouragement doesn't work, there are other ways. John Perkins, an ex-world banker, describes them in his famous book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He has done some YouTube video interviews that are quite informative. Perkins explains that the armed forces are the repo men for countries that do not tax their people enough to pay their debt to the IMF and World Banks. U.S. armed forces currently occupy over 150 countries around the world. I think it's maybe closer to 200. Countries that have not adopted the central banking scheme are the ones listed as enemies and terrorists in corporate media. This is how and why democracy is being spread throughout the world. Democracy means Western democracy. Central banks, along with secret brotherhoods, ultimately leading to progressivism, Bolshevism. Kant speaks on the topic of secret societies in the following quote. The third right also belongs to the state for its preservation, that of inspection, so that no association of political or religious fanatics that could affect the well-being of society remains concealed. Kant, Metaphysics of Morals. The money created by glad-handing has its value reinforced by the courts at home and by guns abroad, but Leviathan always comes home. Banks that finance government keep track of this debt, which is much larger than the current supply, because they intend to collect on it. Fines are levied for breaking statutes that start life as bills. Charges are laid, also as another way of collecting money, although the mechanics of how the court collects its money when it charges somebody, I do not know. It's kind of secretive, I guess. More statutes bring more money to pay more interest on government loans. Phony environmentalism and other fears license governments to write more laws and statutes to keep us safe. When government serves two masters, there's always the ostensible reason and the real reason. Expansion of government services keeps the dream alive, and real wealth generated by actual labor producing useful goods is being exported to slavers. So real wealth now is being produced in China. They make our electronics. They're going to be making a lot more things. They're going to be the manufacturing center of the world, it looks like. So real wealth is actually generated by production. As we lose our productive capabilities to China, we lose control of our economic future. And this is really partly what the New World Order is about, making everybody more interdependent and thus less able to control their own future. Tocqueville comments on the nature of government financing and elections in the following quote: "The American Republic will endure until the day Congress discovers that it can bribe the public with the public's money." Law backs up money, and money backs up law. They are one and the same. Courts that reinforce the value of a monetary system cannot be said to be any better than the monetary system itself. On the private side, legitimate debt does exist. People borrow money to buy things. The problem is that governments finance themselves with private central banks which offer no value to the money. The politicians cannot legitimately promise that it can be paid back, only that they will continue to expand the economy and implement banker think tank policies, non-government organization policies, and bills so that the interest on the loans can continue to be paid. The following quote illustrates the power that banks have over government. "Let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who writes the laws." So there's not really a lot that cannot be fixed. We do have an existing society that is essentially based on freedom, Christian law, and governments could create and simply spend money into the economy. Kennedy wanted to print off US notes, and like other presidents that endorsed similar sentiments, he was assassinated. But countries are really governed by political will, so there needs to be a political will for this fundamental change to take place if it is going to take place. Government money allows management of economic downturns. They can be mitigated by government projects, so the government could manage the monetary supply in a productive way. If there was a depression, then they could simply build more infrastructure by spending currency into the economy. If a bridge needed to be built, the money simply gets printed, and the builders of the bridge spread asset money throughout the economy. The money that they have is money that they actually did work for, so it has a real value. In this case, not every dollar bears the burden of interest. Not every dollar would be rented from banks, and taxation would be a method of inflation control. And that's partly the purpose of taxation now, is to manage the money supply within the economy, so the bankers print it off and give it to their friends, and then you pay it back. Governments would not serve two masters if governments created and spent their own money into the economy. Tax burdens would be substantially reduced, the price of goods and services would be reduced, and people would not live in economic fear. Honest money could bring a renaissance that we can't really even imagine. Imagine if you only had to work 20 or 30 hours a week to support yourself in comfort and not have to build up assets and not have economic fear. This would lead to a new freedom that I think the powers that be would be afraid of. But people are really being distracted from these essential truths with the conspiracy theories that are really pure fiction. Things like aliens are going to attack us, and there's free energy, and there's a giant conspiracy to hide the fact that we can have free energy. The Earth is flat. New planets are entering our solar system. And I think really these ideas are being planted in the alternative truth movement by the CIA or other intelligence agencies. People talking about free energy really don't know anything about science, and people that are talking about the Earth is flat, they don't know anything about physics. And whether or not a new planet is entering our solar system is something that we determine from what we see on a video, and anything can be created on the video. And that goes for alien sightings and so forth as well. I mean, if they can make Hollywood movies that look like flying saucers are flying around, they can do the same thing in real life and put these videos out through the truth movements and alternative truth movements. So really there's a lot of noise out there to distract us from the essential truth. Actually, two essential truths is that, one, we desperately need monetary reform, and two, we won't achieve monetary reform unless there's a great political will to achieve this.